I am pleased to welcome Dr. Rafiqah Mustafaa, who will lead the discussion today. Dr. Mustafaa is the Assistant Director of Learning and Improvement on CASEL's research team, and her work regularly interacts with adult SEL as she supports CASEL staff in developing systems to set goals for their work, track progress, and use data for learning and decision-making. These processes require leveraging SEL competencies and transformative SEL constructs like relationship skills, collaborative problem solving, and curiosity. We're excited to start the conversation and welcome.
Thank you, Emily. And welcome, everyone. We're excited to see you here as we continue this series on adult SEL. Now, if you were here for session 1, then you'll remember that we talked about adult SEL and how critical it is for young people, but also educators, family members, and community. As we think about the importance of adult SEL for all of us, let's begin by taking a moment to reflect on this quote from a recent CASEL SEL Innovations report titled, Building Authentic School-Family Partnerships Through the Lens of Social and Emotional Learning. The quote reads, "We contend that through relationship building and collaborative problem solving, schools and families can come together to not only solve problems, but co-create equitable learning environments for their youth." As you read this quote, I'd like you to consider, what are some of the skills that you believe are needed for adults in schools, families, and broader communities as they build relationships and collaborate to solve problems in their context? Let's take a few minutes to reflect. And as you reflect, please consider sharing in the chat and also sharing on social media such as via your Twitter. Thank you. I hope that opportunity to reflect was useful in this moment. Now, what we just engaged in was an example of a warm welcome. This is the first in CASEL's 3 signature practices, which are a practical way to regularly integrate SEL into meetings, classes, and other gatherings with young people, and in today's case, adults. The warm welcome is an opportunity to build community and prepare for the work ahead. Throughout our time together today, you'll see our integration of the other 2 practices that make up the 3 signature practices along with the warm welcome. So when we talk about adult SEL, what do we mean? Well, if you joined us for session 1, this will be a quick refresher on adult SEL to ensure that we're all starting from a shared definition. When we think about our definition for SEL and specifically adult SEL, we're referring to the shared process of human development across the lifespan. We're also including a focus on partnerships between schools, families, and communities to build the skills and well-being that contribute to thriving communities. These partnerships allow adults to establish the trusting relationships that ultimately lead to more meaningful learning experiences for all. Now, a key point from session 1 was defining who we mean when we say adult SEL. When we think of adult SEL, we think about SEL as a part of a systemic process. When we look at the rings here, we know that the adults in all of these contexts must be attended to when we talk about adult SEL. So we're not just talking about teachers or even just school staff, but we're also thinking about families and community members. By expanding this focus, we pave the way to more authentic partnerships and maximize the strengths that all of these adults bring to our learning communities. So now that we've talked about what we mean when we say adult SEL and who we're talking about, now let's talk about how we promote adult SEL. In session 1 of the series, we also reviewed CASEL's model for adult SEL, which is grounded in these 3 areas: learn, connect and collaborate, and model. By learn, we mean understanding the theory and practice of SEL for oneself, and also in support of student SEL. It includes self-reflection and professional learning plans for all adults. By connect and collaborate, we mean putting these skills into practice. This includes learning communities, embedding SEL practices into staff and community meetings and family connections, peer mentorship and consultancies, and ensuring that we have a shared language for SEL across all layers of adults that are supporting young people. And when we talk about modeling, we mean putting these skills and mindsets into practice across all interactions with other adults and young people. This helps to promote continued learning and practicing for young people, and includes incorporating SEL into leadership practice. So we've talked about the what of SEL, the who, and the how. Now let's talk a little bit more about the research on adult SEL. So inside of the classroom, we can think about teachers and SEL, and the research is clear that SEL adults benefits teachers in many ways. So, for example, by decreasing burnout and promoting work satisfaction and retention. Also by promoting stronger relationships with students and overall growth in key areas such as empathy and healthy communication. We can also look at research on adult SEL outside of the classroom, and that comes from a number of fields like child development, family engagement, and thinking about the benefits of SEL for family members, caregivers. So, research has found that caregivers who participate in engagements to learn about and collaborate around SEL also engage with and exercise agency with various school activities and decision making engagements. Some research has also found that when parents participate in explicit SEL programming, they have an increased understanding of child development, methods for navigating parent child relationships, and also opportunities for supporting their child's behavioral engagements. And finally, other research has shown that outcomes for parents and their children are improved when they participate in culturally relevant and responsive programs. So now that we've had an opportunity to just review some of what we know from the SEL research on adult SEL, we'd like to take a moment to pause and reflect on this prompt. What is one question that you have about the research that we just reviewed? This can be a question about something that was shared, or maybe it's something you want to learn more about. So let's take a moment to please pause and reflect, but also feel free to share with others in the chat. Thank you. Now, this prompt was an example of an engaging strategy. This is the second of the three signature practices. The purpose of engaging strategies are to process the learning and think about next steps for how that learning can be applied to our context. So now I'm excited to welcome the panelists to the screen. Our first panelist is Dr. Kamilah Legette. She's an assistant professor at the University of Denver in psychology department. Her interdisciplinary research investigates individual and institutional racial biases in teachers and schools and their impact on youth academic performance and social, emotional, and identity development. She also studies the implications of these biases on teachers' curricular placement and discipline decisions. The goal of this work is to inform effective interventions, school policy changes, and teacher preparation programs to optimize healthy development for all youth. Kamilah earned a PhD in Human Development and Family Studies from UNC Greensboro, a master's in counselor education from UNC Charlotte, and a bachelor in psychology from Spelman College. Thank you for joining us, Kamilah. Our second panelist is Dan Gilbert. Dan joined the Afterschool Alliance in 2014. As Director of Whole Child Initiatives, Dan directs the Alliance's work around social and emotional development, trauma-informed care, youth mental and emotional well-being, and non-cognitive skill development. He also works to advance the Alliance's outreach and messaging efforts, coordinates activities and collaborative efforts with partner organizations, and plans and implements projects including performing research and writing and disseminating projects for stakeholders at the national, state, and local levels. Dan has experience working for the Massachusetts state government, European Parliament, and political campaigns, and most recently worked at the Alliance for Excellent Education Center for Digital Learning and Policy. He has a master's in public administration from the Trachtenberg School at the George Washington University, and a bachelor's degree in political science from Northeastern University in Boston. Thank you, Dan, for joining us. Our third panelist is Dr. Summer Braun. Summer is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology and affiliated with the Center for Youth Development and Intervention at the University of Alabama. Her research centers on schools as an important context for children's development. Her program of research uses a variety of methodologies to examine teachers' social and emotional competencies, occupational health and well being, and their associations with students' social, emotional, and behavioral development. Her work bridges research and practice by studying interventions designed to support the health and well being of teachers and students, such as mindfulness based wellness programs. Summer earned her PhD in Human Development and Family Studies at at the Pennsylvania State University, which is also my alma mater. So now we'll move into a discussion with our panelists. Our first panelist question goes to Summer. So Summer, can you share some of your key learnings and proposed recommendations when it comes to teachers' social and emotional competence? And then based on this research, what would you say are some strategies that educators and administrators can engage in?
Yeah, I think there's so much to talk about here. Thank you everyone for being here and for inviting me to be part of this panel. So I guess I want to start by just saying that most of the work around social emotional learning has focused on students. And so we're taking a totally different angle here by focusing on adults. And so you talked about the different adults that are in children's lives, and my research focuses primarily on teachers. And so we really don't know a lot about teachers' own social and emotional competencies. But I want to start by saying that the way that I think about teachers' social emotional competencies are different from their occupational health and well-being. Often we talk about teacher well-being and we lump a lot of things in there. But I think about teachers' social and emotional competencies as giving them these core skills that we think really underlie their ability to thrive and underlies their well-being. And so we can think about teachers' social and emotional competencies as being connected to other teacher-related experiences. Also, their social emotional competencies linking to their classroom practices. And then most distally here, how their social and emotional competencies might be related to students' experiences in the classroom. And so I'll walk through a little bit about each of those. And so some new research that we have going on, which I'm really excited about, we've done some preliminary analyses, has shown that teachers' own emotional competencies, like their mindfulness skills particularly, and self-compassion, are predictive, if we're thinking about at the teacher level, of teachers' reports of depression, anxiety, stress, and burnout. And so those teachers who were more mindful and reporting that they had greater self-compassion here struggled less with depression, anxiety, stress, and burnout. And so really suggesting here that these emotional competencies, social and emotional competencies, are really helpful in protecting teachers from these negative kinds of experiences that they often have. When we think about the association between teachers' social emotional competencies and student outcomes, we have done some work with Kim Schoenert-Reichelt, who I understand was on the last call here, so you might have heard a little bit about this already. We found that teachers who were engaged in more cognitive reappraisal, which is thought to be a healthy emotion regulation strategy, where somebody's looking at a emotionally charged situation from a slightly different perspective. So teachers who were engaged in more cognitive reappraisal actually had students in their class who were reporting that they were less emotionally distressed, so less anxious and less depressed. We also found that teachers who were engaged in more expressive suppression, so expressive suppression is thought to be an unhealthy emotion regulation strategy where you kind of try and suppress what you're feeling. There's been research showing here that expressive suppression really doesn't work that well. And so we're finding here that students are reporting that they are less optimistic and less happy when their teachers are reporting that they are using more expressive suppression. And so we are seeing these links between teachers' own social and emotional competencies and what students are reporting in the classroom. And so when we take a step back here and see that teachers' social and emotional competencies are important not only for their own experiences, but also for the experiences that students are having, That brings us to the second part of your question, which is about the recommendation. So what do we do with this information? And how can we then support the development of these competencies in teachers? So I have kind of two thoughts on that one. The first one is that we have very little research about teacher-facing programs to develop social and emotional competencies. And the majority of the research in this area has really used the mindfulness-based approach to developing these core skills. And so these are programs like CARE and the MBEB program, and these are like pretty fully manualized, pretty intensive programs. They have been shown to have pretty good evidence about developing these skills. And so we might want to think about how teachers, administrators, maybe adults who are involved in children's lives in other ways might be able to use or practice their mindfulness skills to help develop their social and emotional competencies. And so you don't necessarily have to be involved in one of these core programs in order to do that. There are apps that are have an evidence base behind them. For example, the Healthy Minds program is freely available through the App Store. And so that is one evidence-based intervention that is pretty accessible here that can help to develop these skills. My second thought on this is how can we be proactive in developing these core competencies? Because often what we do is wait until teachers are already struggling to try and say, well, now what can we do? But maybe we should be thinking about a proactive approach. So during our teacher preparation programs, for example, or as we're inducting new teachers into our schools, maybe that is the opportunity to develop these core skills so that we can set up our teachers with these social and emotional competencies that we know are really important so that they can start on a good trajectory. So a couple of thoughts about what we can do with this information next.
Thank you, Summer. I really appreciated hearing about the different parts along the trajectory for a teacher where this idea of social emotional competence can be relevant for that training and for that ongoing professional learning and development. So thank you for that. Kamilah, you've done work on teachers' beliefs about racial inequity and the relationship between those beliefs and their perceptions of students' behaviors. Can you talk a bit about the role of adult SEL in this research, and then also share a bit about what you found in your research in this area?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here. So when thinking about the beliefs and causes of racial inequity, I try to look at that from the microsystem. So what are we thinking about? What are those beliefs? And then thinking about how that interacts with the macro and meso systems, how that can shape everyday practices, as well as teachers' own classroom interactions and their perceptions of students. Looking at teachers' beliefs, I've found so far 4 beliefs kind of identified in how teachers are thinking about the causes of racial inequity at the microsystem. One of those being post-racial, so thinking that racial discrimination is no longer existing in America. Cultural deficit, thinking that racially minoritized populations don't value education, or they lack motivation, or don't have a concern or care about schooling. The American dream, so very individualistic, thinking that it's individual causes that relates to racial inequity. So if one is not achieving social economic mobility, then it's up to them and it's their own fault. And then also schooling inequity. So trying to see if teachers are thinking about systemic inequity within the school context. So how do they attribute suspension disparities? How do they attribute academic placement disparities that exist among race? And so trying to see how these beliefs relate to teachers' perceptions. And what I'm finding so far is that cultural deficit beliefs have the strongest impact on teachers' negative perceptions of students. In one study, we had teachers to read these vignettes that describe behaviors of a Black student and a white student. And the only thing that changed in these vignettes was the name of the student. And teachers tended to rate Black boys as being more hostile, more threatening, more serious, and that their behavior represented a pattern when they held these cultural deficit beliefs when compared to white boys. I've also thought like, okay, you can have these beliefs, right? That study was just looking at how one belief might have the most impact, but maybe teachers as well as all hold these multiple beliefs at one time. And then how can that operate in shaping how they're perceiving students? And so again, I try to create these profiles. So how do all of these beliefs align? What does that look like? And again, I'm finding that teachers in this profile that I call racism uninformed, in which they have these really high cultural deficit beliefs, as well as these very high post-racial beliefs. And then racism informed, where they are very much having very high systemic schooling inequity beliefs. And the racism informed teachers tend to view Black students' behaviors as less having less empathy, as well as demonstrating that they believe that they have more threatening and more serious behaviors compared to teachers who are in the racism informed. So again, in these beliefs, cultural deficit is playing a role, schooling inequity, understanding how the school context play a role. And so thinking about these beliefs in adult SEL, I've been thinking social awareness, so viewing the school as this system that perpetuates racial inequity, so teachers having that awareness of that. But then it's also important in terms of thinking about the self-awareness. So how does one participate in perpetuating racial inequity, right? So if you're thinking about yourself in terms of the classroom practices, in terms of your interactions, in terms of just your decision making, then I think you can think how all of these can be shaped by a racism consciousness approach and to shape other social emotional competencies in the school system for a teacher.
I wonder how much have you seen that teachers are really thinking about this intersection of social and emotional learning and race? Are they bringing those two together, are you finding?
No, not at all. So I think it's because though, like you had mentioned in terms of education preparation programs, right, they're not talking about, it, right? So if they talk about race or racism, I think it's more from like a cultural perspective. So embracing multiculturalism, accepting everyone's different and diverse identities, but not thinking about like school as this racialized context. It's not a neutral space. And how am I perpetuating this or disrupting these biases that are occurring within the school? That is not at all.
That's really fascinating. Just earlier, I was talking with a frontline practitioner in an out-of-school time program focused on kind of equity in Colorado. And they were talking about how for some young people at the beginning of the pandemic, they actually felt more safe attending programs virtually. And when you think of just feeling like you are in a safe and supportive learning environment as an enabling condition for SEL, it's so sad for so many young people that they feel more safe not at school, not just from a like physical safety perspective, but from a bias and like the pre-existing ideas for that other people may have about them, even if it's their own teacher. So that's really fascinating. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. And I think we think that school is supposed to be the safe space where everyone feels included and feels valued, and it's this promotive, but we also have to remember that it's not for all students. And so we can't always think that the school is a safe space if we're not creating these equitable practices to create an inclusive environment.
Thank you all for the wonderful conversation. Thank you, Kamilah, for sharing a bit of your research. I think it makes me think of that idea that, right, SEL is always happening. And so if it's happening and we're not interrogating our biases and being socially and self-aware, then we can perpetuate these various types of beliefs and practices. And so being intentional about that reflection and seeing where we are can definitely inform what are our next steps for addressing some of those areas. So thank you.
Yeah.
Now, Dan, given your work around out-of-school time program systems, can you talk a bit about some of the trends that we see in who tends to work as out-of-school time program educators or staff, and then how we can think about promoting adult SEL in service of supporting program educators?
Yeah, certainly. And so I'll give a quick disclaimer. So I am going to be approaching this from kind of a less academic perspective than my co-panelists, more kind of thinking about the systems level approach. So for those of you who may not be familiar, the Afterschool Alliance, who I work for, is a nonprofit advocacy, messaging, research, and policy organization based in Washington, D.C. And we advocate for universal access to high quality, affordable after school and summer learning programs for all kids. I want to be explicit from the get-go. Our team at the Afterschool Alliance obviously cares a lot about after-school programs in particular. It's in the name, but we are huge proponents of all expanded learning programs that occur outside of the traditional school day. So that includes before-school programs, that includes summer learning programs, that includes education programs that occur during the weekend and things like that. And for the purposes of today's panel, I'm going to mostly talk about them just as out-of-school time or OST programs. So one thing that we know about these programs overall is that they are generally more representative of the young people that they serve than the schools that those young people attend. This is not universally true, but generally speaking, I would say the vast majority of out-of-school time program providers, the youth development professionals and the out-of-school time professionals who are working with the young people are more likely to look like the young people that they're serving and come from the communities that those young people come from. Another thing to note is that many out-of-school time frontline staff are also younger than their typical school day educator, and some of them are either still in or barely out of adolescence themselves. We have all these recent studies that show that the brain development that occurs during adolescence doesn't really stop until age 25 or so, and a reasonable percentage of the out-of-school time workforce falls under that age range. And so when we're talking about adult SEL, that means that many of these out-of-school time educators benefit from the same sort of adult SEL opportunities that their school day educator compatriots do, but many of them are actually even more receptive to these kinds of opportunities for social and emotional development because their brains aren't yet done with these kind of these adolescent growth period. I also want to mention that in out-of-school time settings, it's important to consider the adult modeling of social emotional skills and the intentional instruction around SEL, but also the context of relationships and with caring adults in the presence of safe and supportive learning environments that can serve as enabling conditions for the social emotional development of the young people as well. So all these factors come together to really make out-of-school time settings ripe for both SEL, for the young people and for the adults or the young adult professionals working in those settings, as well as for the establishment of something called developmental relationships. There's this developmental relationship framework coming out of the Search Institute that I'm going to talk about a little bit more momentarily, that I think speaks volumes to the ways in which out-of-school time programs can really have profound impact, both in terms of adult SEL and in terms of the SEL outcomes for young people. But that kind of covers the first crux of this question, so I'll pass it back.
Thanks, Dan. Oh,
I'm
Summer, I saw you unmute. Feel free.
I'm just eager to hear more about this model soon, Dan. You teased it. You teased us with it.
Awesome. Something I wanted to follow up on, Dan, was as I was thinking about what you shared about kind of identity and background and how profiles of program staff might sometimes more closely match student backgrounds and demographics than say their like school day teachers and staff. Could you talk a bit about what role that might play in how program staff interact with, collaborate with, engage with families, and what those relationships might look like?
Oh, yeah, certainly. And thank you for the question. So out-of-school time programs do frequently have stronger relationships with parents and families than schools do, not just because they're more representative of the populations that they serve, but also because they often naturally have kind of more points of contact and points of interaction between parents and other family members and program providers. Think when kids are getting picked up from programs or dropped off at programs and things like that. And because they're also not burdened by some of the biases that family members may have originating from their own schooling. And so think of a family member who is going to pick up their kid, and maybe they didn't have a great experience in school themselves, but they certainly don't have any preconceived notions around the after school programs. And so when they go into that school environment, they may be more apprehensive. They may they go back to the version of themselves that may not have appreciated being in that school. Whereas when they're interacting with these youth development professionals in these programs, they don't have that apprehension naturally. When after-school programs in particular have strong relationships with schools, this enables programs to serve as a connector between the school and the families that they serve. And so after-school programs can actually be a huge asset when they have strategic relationships with schools, just in terms of deliberately playing that kind of connector role. And this is especially important. I want to mention up front is because we do know that about 75% of after-school programs do take place in schools, on school campuses. And so it's a real opportunity. They're already there. So if we just make opportunities for those strategic partnerships to be built, it can help everyone involved. It helps the families be more engaged with the young people's experience of the school environment. It helps the programs know more about what's going on in school and align with that in the out-of-school time space. So it's really just a huge kind of lifts all boats opportunity there.
And I think you bring up a good point, Dan, in terms of like the out of school programs, because I remember collaborating with like Boys and Girls Club. There's just a very different relationship that they have with their parents. And I think you're right in terms of just parents' own experiences, but then also thinking about time. So after school programs, parents are off work, they actually can have that interaction with the partners at the community organizations, as opposed to schools wherein maybe they're still working when their kid gets out. And so trying to build that relationship is really difficult. And then they probably had their, like you mentioned, their experiences with out of school programs and how that was more positive for them. Again, as we talked about, school not always being that safe space for people and parents wanting to protect their kids from that.
Thank you all. I had another question for Summer. Summer, you talked quite a bit earlier about adult SEL as we think about teachers and their development. And you also talked about the distinction about how we might think about those outcomes for adults versus how developing adult SEL can impact some outcomes for young people. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about this other area that I know you focus on of teacher well-being and how that might have any relationship to students' social and emotional competence development.
Yeah. So we talk about, when we talk about well-being, the actual constructs that we're measuring are often quite diverse. And so I'll start here with just a little bit about how I think about conceptualizing teacher well-being. And so I actually think about teachers' occupational health as being their experiences related to the workplace. So things like their job stress, teaching efficacy, burnout, occupational burnout, these things we know stem directly from their experiences at work. And then I use the term personal well-being to refer to these experiences that are likely linked to their experiences in the workplace, but don't necessarily stem from the workplace. So things like depression, anxiety, life satisfaction, things like that. And so we can think just as we did when we were talking about teachers' social and emotional competencies, about how teachers' own occupational health and well-being might be associated with some concurrent associations with the teacher themselves. Also have associations between those and their classroom practices, and how teachers' occupational health and well-being might impact students. And so what we know on the occupational health side is that teachers' own occupational health, so again, these experiences like job stress, teaching efficacy, and occupational burnout, they are correlated with other teacher level experiences like their own job satisfaction. At the classroom level, we know that they're associated with the quality of teachers' interactions with students, as well as their classroom management practices. So teachers who are struggling with their occupational health use less proactive and more reactive classroom management practices. And then on the student side, we know that teachers who are struggling with their occupational health actually have students with higher levels of cortisol, which is an indicator of stress. And then we also know that there are links with academic achievement and students' behavior problems in the classroom. And so when we think about the role that teachers' occupational health has, it's obviously impactful for teachers, but also seems to have associations with how they show up in the classroom and then the experiences that their students are having. And then we can think about the well-being side. So these experiences that are not necessarily tied to the workplace, but are likely related here. And so these are things like mental health. Most of the research in this area has really focused on teachers' experiences of depression. There's been a little bit of work on anxiety, but primarily in depression. And so we know that teacher depression is associated with teachers' own experiences of stress, job satisfaction, and teaching efficacy. So the link between occupational health and the personal well-being is there. At the classroom level, we know that teachers who are more depressed have lower quality interactions with their students and also give less positive feedback to students. And then at the student level, we know that teachers who are experiencing higher levels of depression and struggling with their personal well-being have students who struggle with their own social and emotional development. Students are also reporting less pro-social behavior in amongst their peers. And students are also reporting greater challenges with internalizing and externalizing. And there's also been some links with student achievement. And so what I think is really powerful about this research is that it's using teachers' own self-reports of their occupational health and well-being and triangulating that data with observations of their classroom practice, with students' own self-reports of how they're feeling in the classroom. And so the methods that we're using to get at this question about how teachers' occupational health and well-being might be related to their classroom practices and students, we're actually using some pretty compelling methods to answer that question, showing that they really are related. And so we already know that teachers are one of the most stress professions. Anxiety and depression in teachers has skyrocketed in the past couple of years, instigated from the pandemic and also additional factors. And so we should care about teachers, in and of themselves, right? If they're struggling, we should be calling attention to that and doing something to support them. And we know that teachers who are struggling are likely to have students who are struggling. And so if we need an additional reason to support teachers, there's that reason too. And so I think together this research just again brings the spotlight on the need to prioritize and support teachers' own social and emotional competencies and occupational health and well-being. And so that's where we are right now, is thinking creatively about what types of interventions or programs, practices we can bring to teachers and educators to help to develop those skills and support their occupational health and well-being.
Great, thank you, Summer. One thing that came up as you were speaking and thinking about some of, say, the districts that we've worked with is thinking about the strategies that might be implemented for teachers, but then also other school staff. And was just wondering, are you familiar with, or does any of your research touch like the occupational well-being and the or occupational health and well-being outcomes for other school staff or school leadership? Just wondering if any of that research touches on those folks.
Yes, so just as we think that a systemic SEL is likely going to be, more impactful than an individual teacher who's trying to support social emotional learning in their classroom in isolation, we think about this at the school level as well. And so it's not enough to just intervene with one teacher. We really need to be incorporating all of the adults in the school when we're thinking about improving the occupational health and well-being of this workforce. And so that's not just teachers, these are teacher aides, these are principals, these are vice principals, these are staff people. And so while my research is primarily focused on teachers themselves, we are thinking about this at a systems level. And so these skills and competencies and the occupational health of the other adults in the room and in the building are also really important.
Would love to see that expand to include out of school time professionals who may be working in the school as well.
Dan, I see an opportunity to connect here. Yes.
It's not easy to evaluate some of that, but I think that could be some really powerful data.
Mhm.
Your work is also making me think about when you mentioned like teacher well-being and stress and burnout, and then looking at classroom management. So how also bias can play a role in that, right? So if you're stressed and burnt out and teachers have to make these quick decisions, how are all of these playing out in terms of, especially as we think about discipline practices or decision making in terms of their social emotional competency?
Definitely. So if these teachers who are more stressed out are more likely to use these reactive strategies,
Yeah,
they're also more likely to use these strategies differentially for some students than others.
right. Exactly.
Great, thank you. I have another question for Kamilah. So I know you've done a lot of work linking the fields of culturally relevant pedagogy and teacher social emotional competencies and capacities. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about that work.
Yes. So when I talk about culturally relevant pedagogy, I'm thinking about engaging students with the academic curriculum while also affirming and recognizing their racial identities, cultural backgrounds, and lived experiences, and how that comes into the classroom in the school. Within that, there are 5 principles, and I'll talk about each one very briefly, and then how 1 or 2 social emotional competencies for adults or teachers can relate to that. So the first one is identity and achievement, and thinking about ways social identities shape lived experiences, especially in the school. So we have social awareness and self-awareness. Teachers become aware of their own identity and students' racial ethnic identity, ways that these identities can shape how they view the world. And again, as I mentioned before, thinking about recognizing their own biases. The second principle, equity and excellence. So teachers are prioritizing thinking of academic achievement for all and how to create these very embracing learning differences among students to create a very equity-driven classroom that has high expectations for all the students. So we can think about self-awareness, social awareness, responsible decision-making, and how that can play a role in how teachers create these equity-driven classrooms, how they select the practices that can reflect those, as well as how they think about engaging in pedagogy that's multicultural and has different approaches to learning. The third principle, developmental appropriateness. So considering each student in terms of their cognitive, social, and emotional development with a cultural lens, as well as understanding how racism and racial oppression can shape students' cognitive and social and emotional state when they're in the classroom and when they're in school. So teachers with social awareness will consider the impact of racism on students' development, and this involves awareness of teachers to meet students' cognitive and social emotional needs through their responses to what students bring to the classroom. So again, thinking how the implications of racism and discrimination on youth in terms of their mental health, in terms of classroom engagement, in terms of school belonging. So teachers are aware of this and create these practices and understanding that to bring them more involved into the school, but creating this equity-driven climate. The fourth principle is thinking about teaching the whole child. So this just means recognizing students' home and community experiences and how they have implications for classroom experiences. So a little bit about dance work, thinking about that community, having that out of school time, and teachers using this self-awareness and social awareness to consider how their school practices might actually ostracize racially minoritized families and work on ways to reduce those barriers. And then the final one is student-teacher relationship, and that's like demonstrating care and concern for students as individuals while also honoring their race, ethnicity. And so we can think about self-management, social competency within this framework, and offers teachers a way to develop skills and strategies to reduce their racial biases and create equity-driven classroom. And one way can be through empathy, which has been shown to increase positive relationships with Black children.
Thank you, Kamilah. One thing that I was thinking about as you were sharing is, right, how educators often, right, they have many priorities that they're trying to engage and implement, and this idea of thinking about how we integrate these very important components of education and learning, culturally relevant pedagogy, SEL, so that it's not that these things are separate, but how do they work together to support students? So really helpful for thinking about that. All right, I have one more question for Dan. I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about some of the ways that out of school time programs meet the conditions needed to implement high quality SEL for young people.
Yeah, definitely, and so much of what Kamilah just said resonated with me. So I already just talked a little bit about the how out of school time programs are more reflective of the populations they serve than the schools that serve the same young people, generally speaking. And it's also worth noting that young people actually spend substantially more time with individual out of school time educators than they usually do with particular in-school educators, just because they're in the program, they get this face time with these youth development professionals. And the time that they spend with those out of school time educators is more flexible, which can make it a lot easier for young people to bond with the out of school time educators than maybe than their ability to do so with some of their teachers. So it's worth noting, lastly, that the vast majority of out of school time programs already prioritize the creation of safe and supportive learning environments that we know is conducive to SEL. We know that a lot of these programs intentionally encourage a sense of agency and self-efficacy in young people, and that they prioritize the development of strong reciprocal relationships with adults, which all of these we know from research from the most recent, like Navigating SEL from the Inside Out reports from Dr. Stephanie Jones and her team at the EASL Lab, funded by the Wallace Foundation, says all this. But the thing I really want to dive into to appease Summer's earlier inquiry. So I want to take just a couple minutes to talk about the Search Institute's developmental relationship framework, because I think it's a really valuable framework in and of itself, and also incredibly compelling in terms of painting the ways in which out of school time can really help accelerate the social and emotional development of young people. So around a decade ago, we had the 2011 meta-analysis on the effectiveness of SEL, which I'm sure most, if not all, the folks in the audience are familiar with. And so the Search Institute, they had a completely complementary, they call it the developmental assets framework of 40 developmental assets that they worked on. They're an applied research organization, so they're really figuring out how they take this information and make it valuable. And so they decided at that point that they wanted to figure out not just that the implementation of SEL programs was only part of an SEL strategy, and the developmental relationships framework looks into the enabling conditions and kind of what the underlying components that lead into that are. And so in the framework, they define 5 characteristics of what they define as developmental relationships. And these characteristics are: 1, expressing care or conveying to young people that they matter. 2 is challenging growth or pushing young people to continue getting better. 3 is providing support or helping young people complete tasks and achieve goals. 4 is sharing power or treating young people with respect and giving them a say. And 5 is expanding possibilities or connecting young people with people and places that broaden their world. So they started working on this in 2011. In 2021, they published their kind of early findings on the connection between developmental relationships, social emotional learning, and equitable learning environments, bringing it back all the components of today's conversation. And so the findings essentially come down to the fact that young people who have established strong developmental relationships are more than 3 times as likely to self-rate highly on their own social and emotional competencies than their peers who have weak developmental relationships. More than 3 times as likely, 68% versus 22%. So that's a huge point. And furthermore, young people who experienced higher levels of diversity, equity, and inclusion were more than 70% to have strong self-rated SEL skills than their peers. And then bring it around to the kind of where this connects to out of school time. They also had this, they had over 13,000 young people respond to this survey. They found that young people in out of school time environments were more than 75% more likely to say they had a strong developmental relationship than their peers in school environments. 70% of young people in out of school time versus only 40% in school environments. And young people in out of school time environments were 65% more likely to say that their learning environment and experiences reflected diversity, equity, and inclusion. So that's 73 to 44%. And so kind of just to boil it down, a lot of my job is telling out of school time folks to focus on SEL, and the other half is telling SEL folks to focus on out of school time. But what it boils down to for this is that we know that young people are 75% more likely to establish a strong developmental relationship in an out of school time setting than they are in a school setting, and that young people with strong developmental relationships are more than 3 times as likely to self-rate highly on SEL items. And so as an SEL evangelist in the out of school time field, this says wonders about the impact that a lot of programs are already having, and about the potential and possible impact of high quality SEL programming and out of school time programs. So I just wanted to convey that, because it's hard for me to come across data that paints such a clear picture. And it just makes me feel just so empowered about the work that I do and our team at the Afterschool Alliance does to make sure that we're raising awareness in both the SEL space around out of school time and in the out of school time space around SEL.
I think, Dan, you bring an interesting perspective here, because in general, like we don't really talk a lot about adult SEL. And when we do, we talk about the teachers and the administrators, and you bring a totally different lens here to thinking about, well, who else, is really impactful for students. And so obviously these other adults that are interacting with them out of school, play a big role, and your data seems compelling here. So thanks for sharing.
Yeah, of course. And as we talk about the work that y'all are doing, I think that part of it is in out of school time settings, a lot of SEL skills are caught, not taught. And so just making sure that we give those nuggets, that little bit of professional development, because out of school time educators, let's be candid here, they don't have as much professional development. Broadly speaking, they are a less experienced workforce. They are a lower compensated workforce. Often they're kind of seasonal or part-time workers. And so making sure that we give them just the entry level to developing their own social and emotional skills, because they have these strong relationships that really enable SEL to come to fruition with the young people that they're working with. And it's exciting.
Well, thank you all. I hate to end the conversation because you all have shared some really interesting and valuable insights. So just want to thank you for that. I know I've enjoyed this time, and hopefully all of the audience has enjoyed it as well. So as we prepare to close, I'd like to highlight a few key takeaways that I documented while you all were sharing. One of them is really thinking about how critical it is that we continue to think about the importance of adult SEL at a systemic level, and really thinking about, creating conditions for adults to engage in this work and making sure they have the guidance and the resources needed to do it. But then also promoting adult SEL at an individual level and thinking about the particular skills that adults can develop that support their lifelong development and learning. You've also highlighted some really critical outcomes that we can think about as connected to adult SEL. So, not thinking about SEL as separate from, occupational health and well-being for teachers, not thinking of it as separate from the importance of thinking about academics for young people, but thinking about how these things are integrated and really build on each other. And then a third was thinking about elevating how critical adult SEL is as a component of living and learning and collaborating in so many settings. So, school buildings and after school programs and at home and in community spaces. So, just continuing to think about and understand adult SEL as important when we think about the young people that adults interact with in all of these spaces. But then also thinking about adult SEL as critical and important in itself for the adults themselves. So now we'll end with the third signature practice, which is the intentional close. And the intentional close is an opportunity to reflect on the importance of this topic, to appreciate the learning we've engaged in today, and to think about what's next. So, to end our time today, let's make a commitment to be curious and learn more about something we heard today. Maybe connect with someone to collaborate, or be more intentional in modeling SEL in a certain context. So let's take a moment to jot that commitment down. Maybe tweet your key takeaway or mark your calendars for that upcoming learning or connection. So let's just take a moment to engage in that reflection and to jot some things down. Great, thank you.
We appreciate everybody joining us today. Thank you again to our wonderful panelists. Enjoy the rest of your day, everybody.